welcome to another episode of Interregnum, PTO's show within a show with Richard Seymour. In today's episode, we talked about the Trump administration's attack on Venezuela and its broader regional and global implications. We spoke about whether the United States is retreating to becoming a mere regional power, how unprecedented the attack was given the history of US intervention in Central and South America, and why Trump's actions are, in Richard's view, hastening America's imperial decline and facilitating China's global rise. If you find today's episode useful, then please consider becoming a £5 patron of the podcast. The show depends entirely upon listener support, and as well as keeping PCO going, you'll also get access to bonus content. You can support the show in pounds or whatever your local currency happens to be, and you can pledge any amount you choose. Go to patreon.com/polltheoryother to sign up. So, Richard, let's maybe start on the question of why the Trump administration carried out the abduction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and the First Lady Celia Flores at this particular moment in time. So there seems to be a lot of different factors at play, some of them more long range, such as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio's rabid anti-communism, the desire, especially on the part of Stephen Miller, to create a pretext for mass deportations of Venezuelans from the United States. And then there's Trump's openly expressed desire to control the country's oil. In that vein, as we'll come on to later, there's the matter of the Maduro government's territorial claims against neighboring Guyana, where there are major offshore oil resources. Then there are sort of more proximate factors, such as that it was perhaps felt within the administration that the long-standing US military buildup in the area needed to result in something major, whereas standing US forces down with only minor gains or an inconclusive result might have been perceived by the administration as showing weakness. And then finally, there's been speculation about diverting attention from domestic problems, specifically the Epstein investigations. So what's your view? What do you think are the most important causal factors here?
I mean, not to be crude, but at this stage, who knows why these bull routes do anything? I mean, I think we overestimate the strategic coherence of what is a fairly divided and capricious administration. But your question actually is very precise because you ask, why at this particular moment in time? Operation Absolute Resolve, as it's called, they always have these ridiculous names, was being planned and haggled over and lobbied for months. So, they had covert surveillance underway, they had CIA infiltration, there was the strategic buildup in the Caribbean, the terrorist bombings of the boats, alleged without evidence to be trafficking narcotics. There apparently was negotiations with the PSUV leadership, especially Delcy Rodriguez, who now takes over as the interim president, and is apparently well regarded by the Venezuelan capitalist class. So from everything we know about this operation, Rubio formed an axis along with people like Stephen Miller and Pete Hegseth. Greg Grandin calls them the war party on this issue, and kind of worked day and night in the White House alongside Trump in Florida, because he spends a lot of time there, and that's where Rubio's from, to plan for and lobby for this raid.
And sorry, Richard, you say they're the war party. That would be in contrast perhaps to J.D. Vance, right, who has a more sort of isolationist perspective.
Yeah, I suspect this is not something he wanted any part of. There are other figures like Richard Grenell, who makes money out of Venezuela, and was part of an important powerful faction in the White House who wanted to deal with Maduro. But they were all excluded, as were a lot of senior State Department officials. So you got basically a very small faction. This is not the normal policy process, by the way. This is just the way Trump operates. And what seems to have been particularly important is that Rubio was able to persuade Miller, who initially just thought, Venezuela is a good place to dump deportees. But by getting him on board and talking about narco-trafficking and all the rest of it, which he seems remarkably to have bought hook, line, and sinker. I don't know whether he's just totally cynical about that. He seems particularly brain dead to me. But that made them a good double team in persuading Trump to go for it. So there was this intense factional fighting for this policy, wrought by a handful of well-placed people around Rubio. Now, we know that the formal legal rationale isn't serious. Trump pardoned Hernandez in Honduras, as you'll remember, despite the fact that he was, jailed as a serious narco trafficker. Rubio comes, as Tariq Ali points out, from a privileged coke dealing family, namely, I think, referring to his older brother. Special forces that took out Maduro, Delta Force, have a rather murky history of cartel building and drug dealing, according to Seth Harper. And that's just the recent face of US narco imperialism. This stuff about the Cartel de los Sols, the supposed gang Maduro was in, we know now that's been dropped by the Justice Department to stop the prosecution from falling apart. So the whole legal angle is transparent bullshit. And they pivoted amazingly rapidly to oil. Trump says, they're going to get the oil flowing. The White House says they're going to control it indefinitely. J.D. Vance, interviewed by Fox's top bootlicker, Jesse Waters, says that this is going to benefit the American working class because they're going to be controlling all that good oil. Rubio says, oh, yeah, America is going to control 30 to 50 million barrels of oil and use it to control the revenues and make sure they don't go to those who are corrupt, and to secure a political amnesty for the opposition who are in jail, and to induce reform, the kind that Washington likes. So the official rationale is we steal your oil at gunpoint, and we use that leverage to control your country and to placate our own base. It's strange to think that's a winning line after Iraq. I don't think we have to take their word for it. Look, oil obviously is a factor, and I know we're going to come back to the Guyanese oil and the sort of issue of Guyanese territory, so I'll hold off on that for now. They didn't necessarily need a change of leadership to get control of Venezuela's oil. Chevron was already in there drilling, accounts for about a quarter of the oil that's pumped out of Venezuela, thanks in part to the sanctions relief negotiated by Grinnell. So if they wanted American companies exploiting Venezuelan oil, they just had to let people like Grinnell do what they were doing. And if they wanted more,
And also, this is not conventional 20th century resource imperialism, right? There's no sense that the oil majors have been particularly lobbying for this, right? This is a project of the administration rather than acting under pressure from the American capitalist class.
well, I know we're going to come back to Guyana. Exxon plays an important role here in contrast to Chevron.
Mm.
So that's not totally without foundation, but we'll come back to it. But, I mean, if they wanted more than what Maduro was going to concede, he had himself declared to Ignacio Ramonet for Telesur days before the abduction that he was open to any American oil investment, any economic settlement, any deal to combat supposed narco trafficking. He would yield on all the points of contention. So, question is, why were they so determined to abduct him and his wife? And I've got to be honest, I don't think there's one answer to this.
Mm.
I mean, I think it's partly because there's a country whose president has been abducted without breaking a sweat is going to be a much more pliable country, partly because it's a nice object lesson for regional rulers, and Rubio is, as you mentioned, an obsessive anti-communist from the Miami right who wants to take out Cuba. He made a point of saying the Cuban government should be very worried about this, and I think honestly, partly they went with it because they thought it would be badass. If you saw the Donroe Doctrine meme posted by Trump, I'm sure you know the details of this, Alex, which is an open celebration of big stick wielding imperialism, right?
Yeah, I mean, completely extraordinary. I mean, if anyone hasn't seen this, this is a cartoon shared by the Trump administration, which shows Trump bestriding the Western Hemisphere, holding a cudgel which has Donroe Doctrine written on it. And this is adapted from a famous 1905 cartoon by Louis Dalrymple, which was titled Expansion, The Western Patrol's Long Reach, which was obviously meant as critical commentary on American policy in Latin America. And yeah, we have this bizarre sort of situation where the critique is kind of adopted as if to say, yes, we're imperialists and we're unapologetic about that. I mean, another example
Yeah.
more recently, I think it was either today or yesterday, Trump referring to the involvement of quote unquote big oil in Venezuela. Again, a term of critique. As an American president, you don't talk of big oil. That's not a term you use. That's a term from critics of whether it's big oil or big pharma and what have you. So yeah, it's all very, very bizarre. But sorry, I sort of interrupted you there.
Trump loves big and beautiful. Yeah, so you're right. Raw, lawless power without apology, make everyone afraid. I think Vance was on Fox and he was saying, it's our neighborhood, we're in charge, we say what goes. Quite brazenly, Trump tells the New York Times, I don't need international law. He says he's constrained only by his own morality.
Absolutely terrifying statement. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we had Stephen Miller's Pensées, the world is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world since the beginning of time. This all expresses what I think is really a fascistic core to this. So a lot of this is the penchant for spectacular acts of violent sovereignty that defy inherited norms and that put the world on notice. We stand for power. Ultimately, that is our goal here. All the various strategic maneuvers and so on are subordinate to that ultimate goal. We stand for raw, unvarnished power, unlike traditional Washington, which stands for power in the form of hegemony. And we'll come back to that too, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so you've already touched on it a little bit, but an additional factor in all of this, as you say, and perhaps a more sort of strategically rational one, perhaps, is Venezuela's claims vis-a-vis Guyana, whose resources are recent discoveries made offshore. This seems to be oil that is more readily recoverable and more profitable than Venezuela's. So yeah, can you say something on what's been going on regarding the two countries? Because I think this was something that was relatively discussed, at least initially.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the claim to the Essequibo territory, which dates back to the 19th century. It's basically a long-standing refusal of colonial boundaries. And this territory is resource rich, and it extends to major offshore oil, as you mentioned, billions of barrels of proven reserves, and it's really good stuff. It's not like the lower quality, harder to access Venezuelan reserves. And Rubio has certainly used this issue to rally regional opinion against Venezuela, defending Guyana's territorial integrity against Maduro's revanchist claims. Amy Westervelt, formerly of The Intercept, now the editor of Drilled, has argued that this is actually an underestimated factor in the decision ultimately to go for this raid. She's previously done some great reporting on how the Guyanese government is basically owned by Exxon. And in her piece for Drilled, she says Maduro had become increasingly aggressive in his territorial claims, which would be, I mean, if you look at a map, it's significantly more than half of Guyana as it currently exists. So in 2023, they had the referendum on annexation, I think, staged by Maduro. Probably rigged, like the elections, to be honest, but claiming an overwhelming mandate from Venezuelan citizens to take it over. At the same time, Venezuela's been escalating military operations, harassing Guyanese oil installations, Guyanese navy. So there's this triangle of interests here. There's the Maduro government, there's the Guyanese government and Exxon and US imperialism. They all have a stake in that abundant, good quality oil in Guyanese waters. It's got to be a factor. I suspect, to be honest, a minor one in Rubio's thinking, because yes, of course, they care about who exploits the oil, particularly since they have given up on the idea of controlling renewable energy in the future. But I think if US imperialism just wanted to stop harassment of Guyanese facilities and to protect Exxon, Maduro was going to yield. I mean, he didn't have anything with which not to yield. But if you take this factor in conjunction with the others that you've mentioned, Rubio's anti-communism, the Donroe Doctrine, Trump's penchant for big, spectacular acts of violence, Chinese commercial reach in Latin America, and then I think actually those who refer to domestic stagnation and failures are right. There's a need to keep up dynamism in order to avoid being waylaid by any number of crises, like, for example, this recent ICE murder. When you put it in that context, it kind of makes a certain sense. I don't think it's straightforwardly rational resource imperialism, but, they care about resources, and they particularly care about the resources of the hemisphere.
And just on that point about diverting from domestic problems, I mean, it was widely reported that there was very little prior enthusiasm for an operation of this kind. But since it's taken place, we've seen a dramatic increase in support from Republican voters, at least. So it does seem to be rallying the base. Do you think that an additional factor in the decision to carry out the attack on Venezuela and the abduction of Maduro was this general and not uncontested rightward turn that we've seen in Latin America? I mean, most recently, we saw in November the election of Jose Antonio Cast as president of Chile. This guy, like an open admirer of the Pinochet dictatorship, the son of a Wehrmacht lieutenant and Nazi party member. Do you think there was perhaps a perception that regional opposition and criticism would be somewhat muted because of that rightward turn? Although good reason to think that they wouldn't care about that. But is there a sense on the part of the administration that history is on their side and that gives them a sort of, has a kind of emboldening effect on how they're acting?
Yeah, I suspect that might be a part of the thinking behind Rubio's domino theory. And I think sponsoring the far right is an explicit component of Trump's national security doctrine. It's not baseless, although I think the dominoes thinking is puerile, always was. There is this right turn. The second pink tide of the early 2020s quickly exhausted itself. You've got an energetic far right that's broken the monopoly of mainstream conservative parties. And so this is part of a global surge, part of the same rightist revival that Trump wants to encourage in Europe as part of the same national security strategy. So, yeah, a factor, but probably not the most important factor. And to be honest, I think that Latin America, a modern, complex, socially differentiated, highly industrialized continent, has its own internal dynamics and will turn right or left based on those dynamics, not primarily based on American imperialism.
The United States has, of course, carried out dozens and dozens of military interventions in Central America and the Caribbean. They've supported right wing coups and military dictatorships throughout South America. And perhaps because of that, and sort of reasonably enough, some left commentary on the attack and the abduction of Maduro and Flores has had a bit of a sort of same as it ever was kind of tone to it. We've seen this before. What's new here? How do you see the attack in historical context? How unprecedented or otherwise do you think it was?
Well, it's certainly not unprecedented. I mean, the obvious reference here would be Noriega, who was the CIA's man, who was a notorious drug dealer and thug. When the US turned against him, they launched Operation Just Cause to take him out and put him on trial. So similar in that respect. And if you look at the legal justifications for that operation and how widely derided they were, and how widely condemned the Bush administration was, they really weren't that much more impressive than those of the Trump administration. The only difference I think there was that Bush Sr. really took the form of law seriously. And I think that's the thing. Traditional Washington really works hard to put its arguments in a legal form because it takes international law seriously. Trump doesn't. Another important difference is that Panamanians were actually really glad to be shot of Noriega and his dingbats. I mean, they didn't come out fighting American forces, and the U.S. put boots on the ground for about 5 years, I think. I don't think they're going to put boots on the ground in Venezuela. I think it'd be really risky for them to do so. They're not interested in state building, and that's why they've gone with Delcy Rodriguez. So I think possibly the unprecedented thing, if there is such in this, is really what it's part of, is its broader historical meaning, which is this is not about America being a state builder or a global hegemon. This is really about spheres of influence, or in this case, hemispheres of influence. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the logistics and the legality and the broader global context, there are strong similarities with the intervention in Panama.
The attack is being described by some commentators as representing a betrayal of Donald Trump's base on the question of intervention abroad. After all, Trump's camp almost portrayed him as a sort of anti war candidate during the election campaign. But in some ways, it seemed actually highly consistent with previous actions, such as the attack on Iran's nuclear facilities last year or the 2020 assassination of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commander Qasem Soleimani. And in both cases, those attacks, like the attack on Venezuela, these were operations that were, for all their violence and for all they were, rightly greeted with horror, they were limited in scope. They didn't involve extended deployment of ground troops. And it reminded me that before Trump was first elected, a book collection of Trump's speeches and interviews going back to the 1980s was put together. This was titled Donald Trump, The Making of a Worldview. And I read that at the time, and it showed that decades ago he was talking about, even back then, about his preference for air power over the deployment of troops, his love of sort of audacious, perhaps quite telegenic, sort of unexpected operations, as opposed to the kind of the long military buildups that preceded things like the Iraq wars. So in some ways, it seems like Donald Trump has actually been remarkably consistent in this area. What's your view on this? Do you think Trump has in some ways betrayed the MAGA base on this question of military intervention abroad, or not really?
Nah. I mean, look, we've had, I mean, you mentioned some of them, but we had bombings in Nigeria, Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, Iran, Syria. We've had constant funding and arming of the Israeli genocide. It's not a non-interventionist presidency. It certainly is a step change in as much as they just abducted a president on a negligible pretext and then gloated about it. And coming along with the threat to annex Greenland, it kind of is a significant fuck you to traditional Washington's system of rule of law and to its supposed allies. Question is, will the MAGA base be sufficiently opposed to cause problems for Trump? Based on the polling you mentioned, one would have to say no. And I suspect that while there is a chunk of MAGA that opposes military entanglements in principle, the majority simply don't want American boots on the ground. They don't want state building. They don't want American cash paying for some other country's well-being as they see it. They're not
And they don't want
concerned.
casualties, right? And in this case, there's not been a single US casualty, right? I mean, it seems like perhaps over 100 Venezuelans were killed, but no US casualties.
Yeah, I mean, and do you think they're concerned about Nigerians being killed? No, they're concerned about the cost of the war. I don't think the support for this is going to be particularly enthusiastic necessarily, but I think the easy win, the easy smackdown that they delivered, obviously is going to be appealing to a lot of the MAGA base because they don't really care about, Venezuela, but they certainly like the idea of smacking down a brown leader who defies America in some way.
Yeah, and they like the machismo of it, right? Like they'll love the optics. They like the idea of special forces. They
As
like
long
the
as it doesn't go
guns
any
and all
further,
of
yeah.
that. Yeah.
As long as there's no further commitments.
Mm.
And that's a real problem because we don't know whether it's going to necessitate further commitment. But I suppose if the MAGA base can cope with the cognitive dissonance over Epstein, they can handle this. They've dealt with far greater reversals before. There are contradictions in this policy, and how they play out will determine whether the MAGA base starts to fragment over it. But I think Trump would have a lot more to worry about if it was actually a major boots on the ground operation.
In a recent blog post that you wrote about the attack on Venezuela, you commented that I think we're supposed to be impressed without thinking too much about the yield. We're supposed to forget the dilemma of a dying empire, which is that almost everything it does to hold off decline diminishes its own future power to act. Um, can you expand on that point? Why does this act, given its success in pure operational terms, diminish their ability to exert US power in the future, and why do you feel sort of so confident describing the US empire as dying?
I think this is part of the retreat from global hegemony. The pivot to hemispheric dominance, the so-called Donroe Doctrine, is at the same time a pivot away from the mechanisms of global authority, institutional control, and legality that made the world relatively smoothly predictable and governable from Washington's point of view. And I also have to ask, in hemispheric terms, what this will actually achieve. Because if it's really about controlling oil, which, as we've said, it kind of is, but in a highly mediated way, then essentially they are staking their future strength on a globally declining energy source. This is a point that James Meadway has made. While China basically builds its dominance in the energy and associated technologies and the infrastructures of the future. So by about 2040, 50, much of the world's going to have access to relatively cheap electric vehicles and solar panels and batteries and other resources of which China will be the major global supplier, sitting on top of a very important value chain. Now, the world's dependence on those renewable infrastructures is going to bind it to China, much as the world's dependence on the motor car, on electric communications, and so on has bound it to the United States in the past. But I suspect it's even worse than that, because this is first and foremost about Rubio, and therefore it's first and foremost about an ideologically retrograde obsession with knocking out regimes and governments that are neither a serious threat to capitalism nor a problem for the US. So what's the yield from that? Do they really think a simple abduction is going to fundamentally transform a region when we know that the US sunk billions into Iraq, committed hundreds of thousands of troops, mobilized a whole apparatus of hegemony to retroactively legalize it and to drag allied states into it, with the whole idea of transforming the Middle East, and of course it was a disaster? I mean, no. All they've done here, They've got a more pliant PSUV in power because they daren't risk boots on the ground, and they can't trust the opposition because it's weak and unpopular. Poor Maria Corrado, whatever her name is, was going around giving speeches to business conferences talking about, we're going to privatize everything that isn't nailed down. You can invest in anything. We've got thousands of miles of coastline which we're going to develop. You can come, begging for the job, but doesn't have enough domestic respect to make it work, and Trump was quite explicit about that. Meanwhile, I suspect quite a lot of Latin American ruling classes, I'm not talking about the states here, the ruling classes, will have had their impression confirmed that Washington under Trump is not reliable. It's too inconstant, it's too fickle, it's too given to swerving between flattery and bullying, incentives and threats, and they will know that, of course, they have to bend the knee to Trump to some extent, but they will also know that things are much easier with the Chinese, who don't care about ideology, they just want to do business. So yeah, the operation went smoothly, but then no one doubted that the US could overwhelm Venezuela's defenses, in this case apparently consisting largely of Cuban soldiers, as the Venezuelan armed forces seem to have scarcely put up a fight. That doesn't mean that it adds to America's total power in any way. Trump does a lot of things that look impressive at first, but quickly only reveal the limits of his power. I mean, if you remember the trade wars with Canada and Mexico, states that, unfortunately for him, produced things that America's economy needed, and needed pretty quickly. That made Scheinbaum look great. It put an anti-Trump liberal in office in Canada. Remember Liberation Day? Big U-turn within 90 days. And by the autumn, the whole 100% tariffs on China was off the table, because it turns out China produces things America needs too. So I would say let's just wait and see how this pans out, because everything about the historical curve and the structural logic, as I understand it, would lead one to expect some form of blowback is not the right term, but some form of consequences and contradictions unfolding further down the line, which will make things harder for the US and easier for the Chinese, basically.
I suppose one way of looking at it is it's almost like a kind of a displacement activity, or they're awarding themselves a consolation prize by hitting Venezuela and potentially Cuba and Iran. That you sort of, yeah, as you described, they're losing the hegemonic battle with China. So instead of that, we just sort of settle some historical scores with the legacies of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, or the Cuban Revolution, and there's some payoff there, even if it doesn't translate into in sort of real power terms. So, I mean, you've mentioned Greenland. So let's turn to some of the broader questions around US strategy, if strategy is even the term. So, quote unquote, acquiring Greenland is sometimes described as being this rather sort of peculiar, quixotic preoccupation of Donald Trump's, rather than an objective that the US security apparatus and the military might genuinely desire. But do you think that in this case that there may be a greater degree of rationality to trying to gain control of Greenland than is sometimes supposed, given the increasing strategic significance of the Arctic to both the US but also China and Russia as a consequence of the climate crisis, and also given the increasing importance of so-called rare earth minerals? I mean, bit of a misnomer, obviously, which are abundant in Greenland, even if it's very questionable as to how easily those resources could be exploited at this point in time.
Yeah, I mean, certainly America is not going to be able to immediately step to processing and mining rare earth minerals, because they haven't built up the infrastructures for it. It would take decades. There is, as you say, a rationality to gaining control. What's interesting is that Trump thinks you have to own the territory to do that. I mean, there was an interview quoted by The Guardian, I think this is also from the New York Times, where his argument for ownership was that it was psychologically important for success and was better than a lease or a treaty. I just think that reflects the crudity of his understanding of power. The whole lesson of US imperialism for a century has been, you don't need the expense and the problems of territorial control to exercise political and economic control. And since Greenland is under Denmark's control, and Denmark is a NATO country and a vassal of the United States, the US would have little difficulty in gaining security access to Greenland, or corporate access, frankly. I note that James Meadway makes the argument in Navarra for a strong logical connection between Venezuela and Greenland, representing a kind of coherent shift in US strategic posture towards shoring up its power over resource rich and strategically located territories in the hemisphere of influence. And he reckons, and I think he's correct on this point, that Trump is becoming more and more serious about Greenland, that it's no longer offhand remarks now. I think he's right. Trump will try to make a move on Greenland before his term is up, and I think perhaps sooner. And one reason I say that is that Trump is someone who has a feel for weakness, and the European response to this has been incredibly weak. When we saw Labour MPs vacillate over Greenland on the news circuit, we saw the European Commission spokesperson prevaricate, refuse to answer the question. Eventually, a weak statement was put out, and that is connected to their extraordinary deference over the raids in Venezuela. So European states are behaving like servants, not independent states, and Trump is going to treat them as such. So it would not surprise me if they came up with some scheme whereby the US could somehow buy or annex Greenland. And yeah, it's going to be a crisis for NATO. But as we will shortly see, given what I know we're going to discuss, that's not a problem for the Trump administration.
A very speculative question, I know, but just going back to Cuba for a moment, where do you think the attack leaves the country? How sort of vulnerable and isolated is Cuba at this point? And do you think the US could plausibly attempt a similar strategy as they've adopted in Venezuela, with a sort of ratcheting up of military pressure and then an attempt to wipe out part of the Cuban leadership? And then either from that position, trying to, as in Venezuela, just intimidate the replacement leadership in Cuba into conforming with US demands, or as just a sort of first step in a strategy of broader destabilization culminating in regime change, which would certainly be the preference of Marco Rubio, if not necessarily Donald Trump himself.
Well, look, I think Rubio is right to this extent. If I were a Cuban official, I'd be very worried right now. I mean, that is his specific animus. It's an unfinished counter-revolution, and the aim is to bring to power political forces that are to the right of Louis XIV. I don't think they can necessarily do exactly what they just did in Venezuela. Now, you can't rule it out, but they can pressure Caracas to get those Cuban soldiers and intelligence officials out. They can pressure it to break diplomatic relations if they want. They can try and change its geopolitical orientation in the region. They can ratchet up Cuba's isolation, expand Caribbean military operations to target Cuban vessels, Cuban whatever. They can escalate and progressively push it to the point where Trump has a decision. He either has to shit or get off the pot. And I mean, it depends on how much trouble the Venezuela business causes Trump. It may soon be something he'd rather move on from, but for now, Rubio and the War Party are very much in command and they're relishing their power, and Trump has had an easy success, and that makes things easier for him. So it wouldn't surprise me if we saw a major operation against Cuba, depending on how the US military assesses the risks, to be honest.
I wonder if also the effects of Israel's operations against Hezbollah and the Iranian leadership, undoubtedly that will have excited the US administration and perhaps, feeds into their belief that you can carry out these sort of spectacular attacks, you can reach people who you didn't think you could reach and yeah, have a sort of further enabling effect. On this question as to whether the US is retreating to becoming a sort of mere hemispheric hegemon, so there's been talk of these sort of trade-offs being made with other major powers, this idea that the US might get a sort of freer hand in the Western Hemisphere in return for China asserting greater control in the Pacific and Russia given major territorial gains in Ukraine, this notion of a sort of relatively peaceable carving up of the world. Is that plausible? And if we really are seeing a carving up of the world into such spheres, wouldn't we expect at some point to see a drawdown of US bases and other military assets abroad?
Well, first point is yes, it absolutely is retreating. I think the main thing it's retreating from is global liberalism and the very idea of hegemony. I'll come back to that in a moment. It's also relinquishing the idea of the US having a truly global sphere of influence, although I think, like a lot of the Chinese analysts, I suspect they believe themselves that this is kind of more like a corporate downsizing than a real retreat. That's a rebalancing effort by which they intend to remain aggressive, competitive, and on top. And to that extent, why would they give up bases if that gives them a certain power and influence? They will draw down bases if and only if they become a nuisance or a budgetary drain or whatever.
Or
But I
perhaps
don't
if
think
there is a
that's
sort of successful trade off to be made with the Chinese, say, some sort of quid pro quo.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I think China has got one base. Maybe there's
Yes. Yeah.
another one somewhere abroad. I don't think that it's on the cards immediately, but
Mm.
not impossible in the next couple of decades. But have you read this truly bonkers national security strategy
Yes.
document?
Yeah.
So you'll know that the top security priority in that document is the homeland, which means borders and white ethnic dominance. The second priority, which is discussed way more than China, is Europe. Europe, it says, is undergoing civilizational erasure, great replacement, so Washington is going to work with a handful of right wing states and support right wing movements to stop it from capitulating to Islam, the third world, whatever. And although in the document there's a lot of bombast about Trump's tremendous success in his trade wars with China, that is rather belied by the subordinate position that China has in the document and by its equivocal and actually somewhat respectful tone, which corresponds to the fact that the administration has failed in its tariffs war and needs a deal with Xi Jinping. I mean, I don't want to overstate this. There is still the stuff about China being a revisionist power, threatening US global dominance. But it's also worth noting this is apparently not the only version of the document. This is the version for public consumption. Now, the White House denies this, but Defense One, which is a very reputable outlet for the defense industry, meaning probably has a lot of spooks working for it, has reported on a private, longer version, which is much more explicit in saying basically the following. First, hegemony has failed. It wasn't achievable, and it was the wrong thing to want. Second, permanent American domination of the entire world is not in the national interest. Third, world leadership needs to be rebalanced so that Europe plays less of a role, with something called a Core Five alliance, comprising the US, China, Russia, India, and Japan being the top countries, because they each have a population of over 100 million. So, US withdrawal from hegemony, new global leadership system based on regional spheres of influence, the demotion of Europe, the de facto end of the Atlantic Alliance, you know, I mean, Denmark says if Trump takes Greenland, that's NATO over. It's too late. I think it's already over. I'd be amazed if European elites didn't actually know that this was happening, hence the enormous transfer of resources to military spending. They're hoping that it's not real. They're hoping that the Trump interlude ends and America gets back to what they like to call leadership. I think they have no idea what they do otherwise. They hope if they can just pander to Trump, flatter his ego, give him little concessions, give him prizes, they can make sure he doesn't wreck the alliance before he goes. But I think they know. They're aware and they're panicking. Pax Americana is over.
For that reason, do you think that what we've seen both from the British but also the Europeans, which, very understandably everyone's looking at as just, incredible, shameful cowardice in how they've responded to the Venezuela situation in Greenland, that it could also be seen as a way of buying time, right? Like you placate Trump for as long as you possibly can in order not to, for him not to do something that will hurt British or European interests, say, but that this is in the service of a military buildup on the part of the Europeans and perhaps, greater military integration and at some point perhaps an independent foreign policy, which they may not want to do, but they may be forced to do at this point.
I think the answer is no. I don't really expect any moves towards military independence whatsoever. I mean, if you wanted to find a European leader who would say, something like we mustn't be the vassals of the Americans, it's usually the French president. And Macron has made statements along those lines in the past, but he's also recently been the most slavish defender of Trump's action in Venezuela and immediately moved to cancel this trade deal they were negotiating with the Mercosur countries. The EU, even if it wasn't, utterly pusillanimous on Greenland and ambiguously satisfied, frankly, with the role of with the outcome in Venezuela, it just doesn't have the political resources to form an independent military pole. I think Peter Gowan put it a few decades ago. It was formed on the principle of negative integration, a very Hayekian principle. The purpose of its rules is primarily to stop states from exercising their economic sovereignty, to neutralize certain forms of state capacity. And that has been reflected for decades in the order liberal line from Berlin and its allies, and in the subordination of its parliament to an unelected civil service. So as a result, it never really built the kind of common European culture, common European political identity that could, in principle, have supported some kind of independent military. And now it's fragmenting And every impulse on the part of European rulers is to try to get further up America's arse and stay there. So, no, not independence would be the last thing I would expect to see from them.
On this question of the world being carved up into spheres of influence, the way in which that development might occur is sometimes described as if it would be, sort of relatively absent of antagonism between the major powers, that they would sort of tolerate violence within their own spheres, but they wouldn't be in conflict with each other. And we see this with the way in which Trump is typically portrayed as being essentially an admirer of particularly Putin, but also Xi Jinping, and almost a collaborator really with Putin when it comes to Ukraine and the future of Ukraine. But presumably any such development would be incredibly dangerous. And perhaps already with the US seizure of the Russian oil tankers, we're seeing actions that presage great power conflict within the context of such a carve up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's any argument about this. The fact is that when I talk about America being a dying empire, I don't mean to sound triumphalist about this. It would be different if this was a decline imposed by, mass movements challenging imperialism and so on. That's not what's happening. This is a global shift in the balance of power with the rise really China is becoming a global power. I mean, we were told for a long time, oh, that's not going to happen. It's going to be regional. Those analyses were wrong. It's becoming a global power. So the context is going to sharpen, as they say, the contradictions and sharpen the antagonisms between the various blocks that are forming. The odds of world war are increasing, not decreasing. So no, definitely not peaceful.
Just further on China's role, and specifically regarding China's role vis-a-vis Latin America, you've argued that the attack on Venezuela is unlikely to affect the relations of states in the region towards China, particularly trading relations. Can you expand on that, and why you don't think this will particularly rebound to the benefit of the United States? Because one could imagine that something like the attack on Venezuela that we saw, that this would have a chilling effect and force perhaps Latin American countries to, even if it's not in their economic interests, to move more into the American sphere due to plain fear.
No doubt that's part of the logic, but the great thing about China, if you're a wannabe Latin American Cordillo or, Pinochet style fascist, they don't care about your ideology. Actually, Xi is not a big fan of Latin American populism. He specifically criticized it as a model. He doesn't like welfare. He thinks that means supporting lazy people not to work. But when it comes to trade and finance, they're all about business. I mean, they've
And this
set
is a
out,
long-standing thing, right? I mean,
yeah.
China had friendly relations with the Pinochet regime, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, but specifically in regard to the turn, specifically since 2010, 2008, 2010, they have set out to weaken their dependence on US and European markets. They sought to build relations with global South states. They built infrastructure and they did it cheap. They lent money with scant conditions compared to IMF loans, notwithstanding the debt traps that are possibly there. They've deliberately been very reasonable where Washington isn't, and they offer major funding, major resources at short notice, which they have the capacity to do, which Washington simply doesn't. And if there are geopolitical issues like, states that don't recognize China's claim to Taiwan, they work around it. I mean, that's why there's such a commercial big deal in Latin America. They are the largest trading partner of Latin American states, larger than America. So I ask you, what incentive does Trump's conduct actually give to any Latin American leader, right or left? Sure, I mean, they will know if they're right wing leaders, they have a little bit more understanding and latitude from Trump, but they also know he's not reliable, and China is. Stephen Miller says strength rules the world, power rules the world. I suspect that he means, military might, brute force, and bloodshed because he's an absolute airhead chud with spam for brains. But if that's true, if that were true, then a good smackdown here and there would bring people into line. That's what you would expect. I just don't think he's right about this. And in particular, I don't think that's how global capitalism works. So, although maybe there would be some short term chilling effect as people try to not provoke the beast, people know things are going to move on and people know China's going to be there. China's, as I say, dependable.
All right. So last question then. So In the recent article you wrote on Venezuela, you were fairly dismissive of the idea that Venezuela is still meaningfully socialist at this point, or any sort of model or inspiration. So I'd be curious to know what your response is to the comments of Ashok Kumar, a political commentator who's actually been on PTO quite some time ago. But he recently had this to say on that topic on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter. So he wrote, under Maduro, Venezuela didn't pivot to neoliberal austerity, unlike all its neighbors, despite sanctions, oil collapse, and hyperinflation. Instead, it doubled down on a defensive redistributive model by expanding social protection through the CLAP food program, cash transfers and pensions, and pandemic era income support, while continuing the Gran Misión Vivienda Venezuela, which delivered 4 million decommodified homes outside the market. Strategic sectors, including oil, electricity, water, and telecoms, remained publicly owned, with no IMF program, no mass privatizations, and no wholesale dismantling of healthcare, education, or pensions, again, unlike its neighbors. Labor protections were maintained through minimum wage hikes, job protection decrees, and emergency bonuses, even as inflation undermined real wages. While the state explicitly treated social reproduction as a public responsibility by expanding women targeted cash transfers to female heads of households, sustaining state run food provisioning and childcare through the mission system, and formally recognizing unpaid care work within welfare and social policy frameworks. In parallel, his government preserved and extended the legal architecture of communal councils and communes, backed collective land titles in rural and indigenous regions, and promoted non market, community based production as an alternative to private property and agrarian commodification. And finally, he wrote, internationally, Maduro pursued South South alliances with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba as a way of resisting US led regime change and financial discipline. What are your thoughts on what Ashok had to say there, and why are you a lot more skeptical about claims that Venezuela remains any sort of inspiration from a socialist perspective at this point, even if it once was?
Look, Ashok is a comrade and a friend, but I just think he's kidding himself here. I mean, he cites in Maduro's favor things like the CLAP food program, which was introduced amid a severe crisis in 2016, like he says, or the Gran Misión Vivienda Venezuela, which Chavez initiated to provide subsidized housing to the poor, or the Carnet de la Patria, which is an identity card which records your socioeconomic status and entitles you to certain help, or even pandemic era income support. Now, hold on. My dear comrade and friend, if pandemic era income support is socialist, then Boris Johnson is a socialist, so let's please be serious. The other items mentioned are all a bit more murky than Ashok lets on. I'm very glad that the Venezuelan state builds houses for poor people. It's not so great that the program is incredibly corrupt and lines the pockets of officials and crooked businessmen like Alex Saab. I'm glad, too, that the government responded to the 2016 crisis, setting aside the causes and all the overdetermined reasons for it by now, by at least supporting the minimal nutritional requirements of a population in crisis, where most Venezuelans were living off of 2 meals or less per day. But that food was low-grade, low nutrition crap, bought at extortionate prices with revenues flowing, again, to corrupt officials. Bit of a pattern here. Incidentally, one of the things that got the Communist Party of Venezuela in trouble and led to it being shut down and taken over by the regime was criticizing the Carnet de la Patria as a mechanism of social control. But let's put all this in the context of a big picture here. Labor's share of national income has just nosedived under Maduro. Government spending as a share of GDP has nosedived throughout the 2010s until now. Today it's about 17.58%, which is way lower than any state in the region except for Guatemala. Its police force has the highest rate of civilians being murdered by cops in the entire continent, and that's saying something. The state wages war on parties to its left. I mentioned the official takeover of the Communist Party of Venezuela. It locks up left-wing trade unionists for protesting for higher wages. The 6 trade unionists who were locked up for protests in 2023 and 2022, which the government called conspiracy and criminal association, were members, all of them, of left-wing parties and unions. I defy anyone to look into the Orwellian process that was and think we're talking about a social state. And it's not a one-off. Maduro has been on an authoritarian bender since at least 2017, the constitutional crisis, when it was actually a senior Chavista, Luisa Ortega Diaz, who spoke out against, for example, stripping parliament of its powers and forced actually a reversal of that decision, though not much else. And of course, she was then sacked. So whatever contradictory but raucously democratic energies fired Chavismo, they're gone, they're defeated. And we can't even say, well, they've retained the husk of state controls in the economy, because since 2020, the state has been privatizing the oil industry, healthcare, and raw material and food import industries, among others. Ashok doesn't mention any of that. I'm confident that Delcy Rodriguez, although Ashok assures us that she's an ideologically hardcore Marxist-Leninist, is going to continue that program and accelerate it. Now, I'm aware, if you want to pull me up here, I'm aware that the regime, and it seems fair to call it a regime these days, has not acted in perfect liberty. It has been under pressure. The end of the commodities booms, sanctions, domestic subversion by a rightist opposition. No doubt the CIA has been behind some of that. So it's not as if this political decay was a matter of the ill will on the part of Maduro or his allies. In fact, by all accounts, Maduro is a practical man. He's not a bloodthirsty psychopath or something. He's trying to solve problems. And while I suspect Chavez might have handled some things a bit differently, we have to be aware that it is the historical process that is determinant here. Chavismo has exhausted its creative possibilities. It has succumbed to its contradictions and produced as its replacement now a form of corrupt, autocratic, patrimonial state in which the material concessions of which Ashok speaks are linked to a whole system of anti-democratic and anti-socialist policies. So why? Why do we have to pretend that nothing has changed, or that why do we have to call it socialism when it hasn't been even moving in that direction for some time? Maybe we should just have higher standards here. Now, I mean, all of that is said in the spirit of ultimately Venezuelan sovereignty, Venezuelan national rights, and what remains of Venezuelan democracy should be defended against Rubio and the far-right fanatics that want to take it all over. But I'm just not prepared to pretend that the collapse of this regime, this speedy way in which the Trump administration was able to take things over, and Delcy Rodriguez's role in all that, has nothing to do with the historical vitiation and evisceration of the Chavista project. I think it's over.
You've been listening to Politics Theory Other. If you've been enjoying PTO and finding it useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 supporter on Patreon. The show depends entirely on listener support, and if you sign up, you can access bonus content, including listener questions episodes with PTO guests. Go to patreon.com/poletheoryother to sign up. The show's music and graphic design is produced by Planet B Productions. Thanks as ever for listening. I'll be back soon.